if I'm depressed for a period of time, if I have been clinically diagnosed with depression, are you then depressed for the rest of your life? Or can you move past that diagnosis and then continue on with your life without that depression and just it being a moment in time?
That's a really important question. And it relates to how, so one of the things that I wanted to try and understand further, um, and it's part of, if you like, the more speculative aspects of writing this book. So one thing I can say that I don't think is speculative is just what I've explained, that mental health definitions are subjective. That's just a fact. It's clearly there. Another thing that I've kind of hinted at in my explanation just now is that what we call psychiatric diagnoses are not diagnoses, certainly not in the medical sense, because they don't point to a potential physical process or cause, at least a proximal one. They are based on a description. So a description, in philosophical terms, has a different ontological basis. In other words, it's a different type of classification. It is not a diagnostic classification. So when we call it a diagnosis, we assume that we've understood a cause. So when we call, oh, you've been diagnosed with depression, we assume that is the cause of your low mood. But as I've explained, that's a form of circular thinking trap. So these are things that I think are factual. But then we have to try and understand what might be driving some of these expansions, and how have we ended up with conditions like, for example, ADHD and autism that started out their clinical life as very rare conditions, predominantly as a diagnosis given predominantly to children. In autism's case, it was a very rare diagnosis, and it was predominantly given to children who had significant learning difficulties. So the sort of children that found it hard to, weren't even intellectually able to attend mainstream schools, for example. They tended to be taught in special educational settings. Many of them didn't develop language properly, or had various peculiarities of language, like something called echolalia, where you would just repeat back the things that people said to you. So that's how it starts out its life, a very rare condition. ADHD starts out its life originally as something called hyperkinetic disorder, at least in this country. So hyperkinetic disorder, excuse me, again, was considered to be very rare. If you had learning difficulties, you automatically excluded somebody from getting this diagnosis because it was assumed that your learning difficulties was the explanation for why you found it hard. You were on the go all the time, and you find it hard to settle and focus. So then it expands into the concept of ADHD, which comes from America. And it comes from America, and it seems attractive because there was this idea that there was a specific type of medical treatment, which was actually amphetamine-based substances. And amphetamine-based substances that were thought to improve your behavior. ADHD then comes in, but it goes into ADD to start with, which is attention deficit disorder. Again, considered to be fairly rare, small percentage of children. And the focus moves from being hyperactive to having difficulty with attention. So here's your first example of a sideways, a horizontal expansion, different behaviors coming into the definition. This is not because anybody had discovered any new biological or anything, any new genetics or any new neuroanatomical differences. This is a conceptual change. And that's what's happened with autism. ADHD and all of these conceptual changes. So the next step is that ADHD is the next development from ADD. So I was training in the as a child psychiatrist. I first trained as a doctor, then a psychiatrist, and then a child psychiatrist in the early to mid 1990s. And I was with a consultant who was very interested in this new concept coming from the US, this ADHD, and wanted to do some research. I was working in East London at the time, and we had a high ethnic minority population. And there were a lot of kids from an Afro-Caribbean background, and they were much more likely to be excluded from school. So he had this concept, oh, maybe that's because they have this condition called ADHD. So I readily agreed to go off and do a literature review and waded through hundreds of papers and all sorts of books and summaries and reviews. And I had that experience of, the will-o'-the-wisp, where something appears in the mist, and every time you move forward to it, you think you've seen it, but there's nothing there. So that's the will-o'-the-wisp. So I was going through all this literature and trying to figure out, so what is ADHD? And that's when I began to realize that there was an assumption that these behaviors represented something, that the behaviors that describing ADHD represented something specific. So this was upside down science, because what you do in science is you start with a hypothesis. You start with a hypothesis and you assume your hypothesis isn't true until you can demonstrate sufficient empirical evidence to support the hypothesis. It's not the other way around. You don't start with assuming your hypothesis is true and then look for evidence to confirm that it can't not be true. You start the other way around. So there was this was up. I realized quite quickly, well, once I'd gone through all these papers, that this was upside down science. How are we assuming that these behaviors equate to something specific, biological, neurological, potentially genetic, whether it's a disorder or a difference, before we can present any evidence that this is the case? So then ADHD expands. So by the 2000s, it was entering into it was ADHD in children had become common practice, and now they were talking about 3% of children, maybe. And then the concept that actually it's a lifelong disorder starts to come in. And so by the mid-2000s, this concept of adult ADHD was beginning to gain traction. About 10 years later, by about 2015, by the way, the criteria had to change for adult ADHD to come into being. So, because up until then, it was assumed that most children grow out of being hyperactive and impulsive and so on, and sort of settle down by their early 20s. And in fact, most of the evidence suggested that was, in fact, the case. But when you introduce the idea of adult ADHD, you started to focus back again on attention. So the concept was, adult ADHD just presents differently when you go into adult. Again, no evidence, no biological evidence. These are what I call construct mutations, and they are mutations. So what starts to come into view now is an idea that ADHD carries on into adulthood, but it presents differently now. So how it presents is in forgetfulness, losing your keys, being disorganized, finding it hard to keep relationships going because you're not reliable, etc., etc. So it's introduced kind of, this idea that you have a more chaotic kind of lifestyle. Things that would have never been thought of as symptoms previously. They're just kind of part of the spectrum of human behaviors. And then in about 2015, it expands vertically again by introducing the concept of masking or camouflage. So the idea is now you don't actually display these behaviors because you're really good at hiding them. But that's how you feel. So it introduces a concept, a new concept. Again, no evidence behind it. This is all conjecture. But why this concept really takes off is because the predominant psychiatric population in adulthood are women. So the concept of masking and camouflaging introduces a whole new group of women into the diagnosis. So this happens in ADHD, it happens in autism. Autism, by the way, has since also then expanded from this very rare to just take in what I consider to be our sense of focus on the idea of sociability. So autism just starts to absorb our increasing focus in a brand image-obsessed age on how sociable we are, how easy we find it to be in the company of others. And it's tapping into that sense of judgmentalism, of shame, of I'm not good enough. Really, these conditions are really tapping into those feelings. And so that one takes off as well. So what we've seen is this expansion, as I say, horizontally and vertically. I've just given you a very brief summary of how those mutations happen. And the important thing to understand is at no point has there been any, even though it's been researched and researched and researched, nobody has found anything specific, characteristic, identifiable at the biological level that differentiates people who have these diagnoses from people. These are really invented categories. And then to get to your question, I know this is a bit of a long preamble just to set the scene about, how these, when it starts coming into the whole thing of ADHD, autism, and the concept that these are lifelong disorders, it starts to merge, in my view. This is one of the things I've proposed in my book. It starts to merge with identity politics. It starts to merge with a movement that developed when essentially the left-right division, if you like, dropped class, dropped socioeconomic difference as the place where they have their disputes about how best to organize an economy, how best to organize a society. Thatcher's famous words when she was asked, "What is your greatest achievement?" and she said, "Tony Blair," and she was right. They dropped classes so now left-right politics was around entryism, what I call entryism, getting more people from different backgrounds into the higher levels of society, not these kind of socioeconomic structural issues. And so the idea of I have some problem with the whole concept of woke, but it's kind of that sort of sense of we have all these disadvantaged groups and we kind of end up with a Olympics of who's more disadvantaged than the other, whether it's based on your sexual orientation, on your ethnicity, and brought into that is this idea of you're neurodiverse or neurotypical. So once you've introduced the concept that these are lifelong conditions, you start to introduce the concept and sensitize people to the idea, oh, maybe I'm struggling. I feel like this because I've got this disorder and I can't help it. So I don't think people are sort of, if you like, intentionally giving up on the idea that they can do something about and change and shift. I think that's what they've been fed. I think we've sensitized the population to this idea that there's a group of people called neurotypical. I don't know how you're meant to identify. And there's a group of people called neurodivergent. And if you're neurodivergent, the workplace doesn't fit for you. And they're not making accommodations for you. Just like, and it's just like gay rights or racism or all of these isms. So you've got something now introduced called ableism. And it's pushing towards an idea that what we need to do is make society more friendly to these groups of people by adjusting workplaces. And so if workplaces don't adjust, so it kind of by default becomes easier to blame your workplace for being ableism unfriendly or whatever you want to call it than it is to maybe see what you can do to improve or change. I mean, it is happening at the same time that workplaces and places like that in society have really become very tough. You know, they have, in times of economic insecurity, that tends to be what happens. You got, unemployment, increasingly people having to hold down 2 jobs and etc. But by doing it this way, we shift the attention away from actually these, what I consider to be more economic, sociostructural, political problems, and it becomes easier to shift it into these are individual types of issues. So about how employment friendly you are, rather than how much the system is hard to survive in this way, and that we should really be looking towards our politicians to be making these changes.
If you enjoyed that clip with Sammy, then YouTube has thrown another clip that it thinks you're going to enjoy. Might even be an episode. And it's going to place it right here.